Make room, wait! What's up, bros, brodettes, my carnivore family? I know I said I was going to talk about Alan Aragon and his ISSN position paper on body composition in my last video, but we're going to take a quick detour and talk about Michael Pollan's food rules instead. This book is really just an expansion of his now famous 3 rules: eat food, not too much, mostly plants, into 64 rules. So he's like this nutritional Jordan Peterson, like times 2 point something. I don't know. In my last video, I gave my definition of food and talked about why definitions of food need to be situated within a broader context, namely that of a dietary philosophy or nutritional philosophy. Well, after making I got around to rereading some Michael Pollan and wondered whether my inclusion of him in the rarefied and distinguished company of those of us in the dietary conservatism camp is actually justified. Now, right out of the gate in this book's dedication, we have this: for my mother, who always knew butter was better than margarine. Is this already, this dedication, evidence that Pollan is a dietary Luddite or some kind of dietary romantic? It sounds a little bit that way to me. It seems to say that we have some sort of natural knowledge or inner light that is a capable guide, and that we know dietary truths instinctually without those instincts having been culturally encoded in any way, and that those unencoded instincts trump our civilized coded instincts. Now, there always seems to be a whiff of Rockwellian nostalgia around all of Michael Pollan's writings, a sort of wistful longing for the farmer's market in America that no longer exists. Pollan's contention otherwise set aside for now. This writing sells very well. It's on brand for him, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, we should do our best to interpret others and engage with their arguments as charitably as we possibly can. And so the real question here is whether we should interpret Pollan as a dietary Luddite or a dietary conservative. Today's video is going to help us do that. 3 principles to keep in mind while we're going through this. Firstly, we need to consider what someone's statements really indicate. Is there any implicit or sort of unstated content we should consider beyond what is explicitly stated or formulated? Secondly, we need to consider the person's broader body of work and their own personal evolution over time. And lastly, we need to consider what I call looseness of human communication. And that's even when we're writing and or making somewhat formal arguments. We aren't perfect. We easily lapse into inconsistency, lack of precision, or fallacious reasoning. Now, there are unstated and implicit premises built into normal human communication that is just intended to be tacitly understood by everyone. It's a type of meaning compression and transmission that we all engage in. Authors and speakers also have a reasonable expectation, in my opinion, that their readers and their hearers understand and engage with their arguments holistically, and this is what charitable interpretation is all about. That said, are Pollan's food rules really indicative of some sort of incorrigible romanticism on his part? Let's pick apart some of Pollan's rules and find out. Rule number 1 is eat food. These days, this is easier said than done, especially when 17,000 new products show up in the supermarket every year, all vying for your food dollar. But most of these items don't deserve to be called food. I call them edible food-like substances. They're highly processed concoctions designed by food scientists, consisting mostly of ingredients derived from corn and soy that no normal person keeps in the pantry. And they contain chemical additives with which the human body has not been long acquainted. Today, much of the challenge of eating well comes down to choosing real food and avoiding these industrial novelties. Now, it might seem like a type of Luddism when taken on its own, but the evidence seems more conclusive when we look at Rule 2, which states, don't eat anything that your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. However, what he says in the actual text of this rule, rule number 2, gives us pause and some room to doubt his commitment to dietary Luddism or some sort of fetishization of the natural. And that is, the reasons to avoid eating such complicated food products are many, and go beyond the various chemical additives and corn and soy derivatives they contain, or the plastics in which they're typically packaged, some of which are probably toxic. Today, foods are processed in ways specifically designed to get us to buy and eat more. By pushing our evolutionary buttons, our inborn preferences for sweetness, fat, salt, probably umami as well. These tastes are difficult to find in nature, but cheap and easy for the food scientists to deploy, with the result that food processing induces us to consume much more of these rarities than what is good for us. There's that word nature, again, that I'm not a fan of, but here it's not really a cipher or a stand-in for all that is opposed to culture and civilization. When you consider the work of Pollan in its entirety, that's obvious. He's not a primitivist or a romantic. Even here, he's bringing into the discussion concepts like hedonic impact, nefarious actors, theories about evolutionary development, a principle of caution about food technologies rather than outright Luddism, and is making some value judgments. Rule 3 says, avoid food products containing ingredients that no ordinary human would keep in the pantry. Whether or not any of these additives pose a proven hazard to your health Many of them haven't been eaten by humans for very long, so they are best avoided. Taken on its own, this might be a kind of cautionary principle, more a fear of radical change than of change itself. But Rule 4, avoid food products that contain high fructose corn syrup, and Rule 7, avoid food products containing ingredients that a third grader cannot pronounce, surely seem to indicate a more comprehensive Luddite lurking in Pollan's text. But he says in the very text of Rule 4, not because high fructose corn syrup is any worse for you than sugar, but because it is, like so many other of the unfamiliar ingredients in packaged foods, a reliable marker for a food product that has been highly processed. Now, pay attention, because my first 2 points about charitable interpretation are about to come to play together and blur. So Pollan says in the text of Rule 4 that HFCS is avoided not directly on account of his chemophobia, but because of what it stands for more generally with regard to food, which are dehydration, refinement, fungibility, commodification, and low nutrient per calorie ratios. We're supposed to understand that this rule, with all of its multitudinous implicit content, is, in addition to understanding it as a narrowly specific rule, and in addition to understanding it in the context of all the other rules Pollan has outlined in his book, which we're not going to go over every one. When we are charitable with our interpretation, he seems to shift pretty solidly from the Luddite or Romantic camp over to the conservative camp. Now, it would be hard to do this, however, right, if we didn't practice these principles of charitable interpretation regularly. So, let's practice. Let's practice. Dr. Robert Lustig's contention that we avoid sugar since it is a long-term, dose-dependent hepatotoxin composed of 50% glucose and 50% fructose that causes metabolic disruption and fatty liver disease, which is ethanol without the buzz, he says, doesn't operate the exact same way as Mr. Pollan's rules do. Yet Mr. Pollan and Dr. Lustig both have the same principle of compressed communication at work, and both deserve the same charity when we interpret their narrower statements. Even Lustig's counsel, which is a very strict prohibition against a singular ingredient, should be placed in a broader context. For Lustig, this broader context would include the principle that isocaloric is not isometabolic. He would also situate his warning about sugar in some other context, that fructose is more dangerous in diets that are already regularly hypercaloric. It is more dangerous in diets that are low in protein, and it's probably more dangerous in diets of people that don't exercise. Taking this principle even further to someone I don't want to do, but I will because I'm trying to live by example, even Freely the Banana Girl deserves to be placed in her fullest context. She doesn't just eat bananas. And this might come as a bit of a shock, but many strict carnivores don't eat meat exclusively. So dietary conservatives, wrapping this up, have a tough project. That is, they have to weigh and balance all the scientific literature, theories about corporate power, thoughts about government power, understanding of the political process, a theory about human agency, a theory about the greater good, and even their thoughts about that bugaboo human intuition against each other, and incorporate them all into a coherent philosophy. So although Pollan has some romantic and Luddite tendencies, he isn't a full-fledged believer. Ultimately, it's my opinion that despite tailoring his language in such a way to make his book sell, he is not totally shrinking away from his duty regarding the conservative project and retreating into Luddism or Romanticism or any other much simpler nutritional paradigm. So, let me know what you think down in the comments. Is Michael Pollan truly one of us, or has he retreated into the woo-woo and adopted one of the more mystical philosophies of human nutrition? Thanks for watching.